He got his girlfriend pregnant before our wedding. I married his Korean billionaire boss for revenge. The fitting room at Maison de Lanque was a sanctuary of soft, golden light and the scent of expensive lilies. Tammy Brooks stood atop a circular platform, her silhouette multiplied by a dozen floor-to-ceiling mirrors that tracked every breath she took. The wedding dress was a masterpiece. Hand-sewn Italian lace that felt like a second skin, with delicate beading that shimmered like fallen stars under the boutique's chandeliers. In the reflection, she looked like royalty, the kind of woman who had finally conquered the chaos of life. Her best friend, Peggy Monroe, would have screamed with joy seeing her like this, but Peggy was thousands of miles away. Tammy was alone in the heart of Seoul, an American woman who had traded everything familiar to build a future with a man she believed was her soulmate. Brad Whitaker was the quintessential success story, American, handsome, and a senior marketing director at Hanul Corporation, one of South Korea's most formidable conglomerates. They had crossed paths 2 years ago at a high-stakes business conference in Singapore. Brad had been relentless. Charming, persistent, and exactly the kind of stability Tammy thought she craved. 6 months after that first meeting, she had packed her life into 4 suitcases and moved to Seoul to be his partner. Now, she was exactly 72 hours away from becoming Mrs. Brad Whitaker. Or so the mirrors told her. The heavy silence of the boutique was punctured by the sharp buzz of her smartphone on the velvet chaise lounge nearby. Tammy glanced at the screen, expecting a last-minute confirmation from the caterer or a sweet, "I love you," from Brad. Instead, it was a notification from an encrypted messaging app. The sender had no profile picture, just a string of anonymous digits, and a single attachment that promised to burn her world to the ground. Her fingers trembled slightly as she swiped the screen open. The image was high definition, cruel in its clarity. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a misunderstanding. There was Brad, her stable fiancé, in the very penthouse they shared, but he wasn't alone. Elizabeth Park, his indispensable secretary, was draped across him, her hand resting over a stomach that was unmistakably, prominently rounded. The caption beneath was a jagged blade to Tammy's heart, "He's choosing the legacy over the placeholder. Ask him about the appointment on Tuesday." The porcelain reflection in the mirror seemed to crack before her eyes. The lace felt like a shroud, the beating like cold sweat against her skin. Tammy didn't scream, she didn't collapse. Instead, a terrifying, icy calm settled over her. She looked at her own eyes, large, observant, and suddenly predatory. She realized then that Brad hadn't just cheated, he had been managing her like a corporate liability, keeping her occupied with silk and flowers while he built a secret life with the daughter of one of Seoul's most powerful political families. Without a word to the hovering seamstress, Tammy stepped off the platform. She began to unbutton the dress with mechanical precision, each ivory button representing a year of misplaced trust discarded. She stepped out of the lace and into her own clothes, a sharp, dark ensemble that felt more like the woman she was becoming. She didn't call Brad. She didn't call the police. She called the only person in Seoul who had more to lose from this scandal than she did. An hour later, Tammy stood in the glass-walled lobby of Hanul Corporation. She wasn't here as a jilted bride, she was here as a strategist. She bypassed the security desk, her eyes fixed on the private elevator bank. She knew exactly where she was going, the 70th floor. The top of the food chain. The doors slid open to an office that breathed power, minimalist, cold, and intimidating. Behind a desk carved from obsidian sat Kang Jae-min. He was the man who kept the engines of South Korea running, a billionaire CEO known as the Glacier for his ruthless efficiency. He looked up, his intense, dark eyes narrowing as they landed on the woman who had just breached his inner sanctum. He didn't ask how she got in. He simply waited. Tammy walked to his desk and placed her phone face up on the polished surface. The image of Brad and Elizabeth filled the space between them. Your senior director is about to cause a multi-billion-dollar merger to collapse because he couldn't keep his hands off a politician's daughter, she said, her voice like velvet-wrapped steel. I'm the only one who can help you reframe the narrative before the press gets this. But I don't want money, Mr. Kong. I want a seat at the table, and I want to watch Brad Whitaker lose everything. Jae-min leaned back, a faint, dangerous glimmer appearing in his gaze as he took in her resolve. He didn't see a victim, he saw an ally. The wedding is in 3 days, he noted, his voice a low rumble. Tammy didn't flinch. The wedding is still happening, she replied. But the groom is going to change. The obsidian desk reflected the harsh, overhead lighting of the 70th floor, casting Kang Jae-min's features in sharp, unforgiving relief. For a long moment, the only sound in the vast office was the faint hum of the building's climate control. Jae-min didn't look at the phone again, he looked at Tammy, his gaze dissecting her with the clinical detachment of a man used to evaluating assets and liabilities. You speak of liquidation and rebranding, as if you've spent your life in this boardroom, Jae-min finally said, his voice a smooth, low-frequency vibration that seemed to resonate in the marrow of Tammy's bones. He rose from his chair, his tall, refined build cutting a dominant silhouette against the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the sprawling, neon-lit arteries of Seoul. Most women in your position would be at home, crying into their discarded lace. Why are you here? Because tears don't have a return on investment, Tammy replied, her voice remaining steady despite the thrum of adrenaline. I've spent 2 years helping Brad Whitaker climb the corporate ladder at Hanoi. I know his files, I know his strategies, and I know exactly how much damage this secret legacy of his will do to your reputation. Jae-min paced toward the window, his hands clasped behind his back. You're right about the damage. Elizabeth Park's father is more than just a politician, he is the swing vote on a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure merger that Hanoi needs to survive the quarter. If the public perceives that a Hanoi executive, one I personally promoted, discarded an American fiancé for the pregnant daughter of our primary political partner, it won't look like a romance. It will look like a bribe. A sordid, clumsy exchange of influence. He turned back to her, his expression unreadable, though the intensity in his dark eyes had shifted from skepticism to a cold, calculating interest. The markets are skittish. They don't want a scandal. They want a narrative of stability and destiny. Then give it to them, Tammy said, stepping closer to the obsidian desk. The wedding in 3 days shouldn't be cancelled. It should be upgraded. If you walk down that aisle with me, the narrative changes instantly. It's no longer about a cheating director and a political payoff. It becomes the story of a powerful CEO who found a fated, intellectual equal, a woman so compelling that the planned wedding of his subordinate was merely a shadow of the real thing. Jae-min let out a short, dry sound that might have been a laugh if there were any warmth in it. A fated love, to mask a corporate disaster. It's audacious. He walked back to her, stopping just inches away. The scent of sandalwood and cold rain clung to him, an atmospheric pressure that made the air feel heavy. But a proposition like this is a lethal one, Ms. Brooks. You would be signing away your autonomy. You would be the First Lady of Hanoi, subject to my schedule, my enemies, and my scrutiny. You would be expected to perform a role with flawless precision. I've been performing for 2 years, trying to fit into the life Brad Whitaker built for me, Tammy countered, her high cheekbones catching the light as she tilted her head back to meet his gaze. I'd rather play a queen in your empire than a manageability problem in his. Jae-min reached out, his long fingers hovering near the edge of the desk before he picked up a sleek, silver pen. Brad thinks you are a problem to be liquidated. He thinks you are an outsider with no leverage. He looked at her, really looked at her, noting the controlled anger in her large, expressive eyes and the strategic stillness of her posture. Let's prove him wrong. I'll have my legal team draft a 15-page contract by morning. It will be the most expensive, fated love, in the history of South Korea. He extended a hand, his touch cold and firm. Welcome to the Hanul Corporation, Tammy. Let's go destroy a narcissist. The silver pen felt heavy in Tammy's hand, a cool, metallic weight that represented the gravity of the decision before her. On the obsidian surface of Kang Jae-min's desk lay 15 pages of dense, legalistic prose, a blueprint for a life that was no longer her own. It was a masterpiece of corporate engineering, detailing everything from the frequency of their public appearances to the specific designers she would wear to ensure the fated love narrative remained visually impeccable. But as she turned to the final page, she didn't sign. Instead, she laid the pen down and met Jae-min's unreadable gaze. "This contract covers Hanul's needs perfectly," Tammy said, her voice echoing slightly in the vast, sterile silence of the penthouse office. "It protects the merger, it secures the political alliance, and it places me in a gilded cage that serves your agenda. But if I am to be your First Lady, I will not be a decorative asset. I am not trading one man's management for another's." Jae-min leaned back, his sharp jawline tightening as he observed her. The air in the room seemed to sharpen, the atmospheric pressure of his presence intensifying. "The terms are more than generous, Ms. Brooks. You will have access to resources most people only dream of." "I don't want a dream, I want a toolkit," Tammy countered, her posture as rigid and strategic as the skyscraper they stood within. "I have two conditions of my own. First, I am to be appointed as a senior consultant within Hanul's International Strategy Division. I helped Brad build his department, I know the gaps in his logic and the weaknesses in his regional planning. I want a legitimate role with a salary and a team. I will not be the woman who only appears at galas." A flicker of something, perhaps a dark, buried respect, passed through Jae-min's focused eyes. He didn't interrupt. He waited for the second blow. "Second," Tammy continued, her fingers grazing the edge of the obsidian desk, "I want full, unrestricted access to Brad Whitaker's personnel files. Not just his performance reviews, but his expense reports, his internal communications, and his digital footprint within this building. If I am to help you reframe this scandal, I need to know exactly how deep his rot goes. I need to know every bridge he's burned and every lie he's told to keep Elizabeth Park in his orbit." Jae-min was silent for a long moment, the city lights below them flickering like a digital heartbeat. He was a man who lived by the rule of the glacier, cold, calculating, and rarely surprised. Yet, here was a woman who had been a victim of betrayal only hours ago, and she was already negotiating for the weapons of his destruction. "You're asking for access that is usually reserved for the board of directors and internal audit," Jae-min noted, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You're asking for the power to dismantle a man's career from the inside out." "Brad thinks I am a problem to be managed," Tammy said, a predatory calm settling over her features. "I want him to realize that I am the variable he failed to calculate. If you want this fated love to be believable, I need to be more than a bride. I need to be a partner who understands the stakes as well as you do." Jae-min reached for a second pen, a gold-nibbed fountain pen that looked like a relic of a more elegant, ruthless era. He scribbled a series of notes on a separate sheet of paper. The additional clauses that would bind their fates together in a way neither of them had anticipated. He slid the new page toward her. "The role of senior consultant is yours. Your office will be on the 68th floor. And as for the files, my chief of staff will provide you with a decrypted tablet by tomorrow morning. Everything Brad Whitaker has ever touched at Hanul will be at your fingertips." Tammy picked up the silver pen. She didn't hesitate this time. She signed her name with a flourish that felt like an execution. As she capped the pen, she looked up at the man who was now her husband in all but the ceremony. "Thank you, Mr. Kang." "Don't thank me yet," Jae-min replied, rising from his chair with a dominant, athletic grace. He walked around the desk until he stood directly in front of her, the subtle tattoo on his neck visible in the dim light, a hint of the rebel beneath the CEO. "You've just gained a career and a target. But you've also gained a shadow. From this moment on, your life is an audit. Make sure your own files are clean, Tammy. Because once we step out of this office, there is no such thing as a private mistake. Tammy met his gaze, her expressive almond eyes showing no fear, only a cold, shared resolve. The scorched earth rebirth had begun. She wasn't just leaving Brad, she was occupying the space he had spent his life trying to reach. And with the billionaire boss as her architect, the ruins of her old life were about to become the foundation of a kingdom. The transition from the sterile, obsidian-walled heights of the Hanul Corporation to Kang Jae-min's private estate felt like stepping out of a digital simulation and into an ancient, breathing fortress. The estate was nestled in the foothills of Bukhansan, a sprawling complex of dark stone, glass, and shadows that seemed to absorb the moonlight. As the heavy iron gates hissed shut behind the sleek black sedan, Tammy felt the final thread connecting her to her old life snap. There was no room for the ghosts of Brad Whitaker's lies here, the air was too thin, the silence too absolute. Jae-min led her through a cavernous foyer where the floors were polished to such a high sheen they looked like deep water. He didn't offer to carry her bags, nor did he call for a servant. He moved with a predatory efficiency, his footsteps making no sound on the stone. When they reached the wing that would serve as her quarters for the duration of the contract, he stopped before a massive set of double doors carved from reclaimed timber. "Your biometric data has already been synced to the locks," he said, not turning to look at her. "Inside, you will find the decrypted tablet I promised. It contains the personnel files, the expense reports, and the digital debris of Brad's last 18 months. My chief of staff has also curated a selection of Hanul's internal strategy briefs. If you are to be a senior consultant by Monday, I suggest you begin your audit tonight." He turned then, the motion causing his silk tie to loosen slightly. In the dim, recessed lighting of the hallway, Tammy caught her first clear glimpse of the ink that had been a mere whisper in the office. The tattoo on his neck wasn't just a mark, it was a sprawling, intricate dragon that emerged from beneath his collar, its scales swirling upward toward his jawline. It was a jarring, violent contrast to the tailored perfection of his suit. It was the mark of a man who had once been a rebel, perhaps still was, hiding behind the cold, impenetrable mask of a CEO. "You're staring," Jae-min noted, his voice dropping into that dangerous, low-frequency rumble. "I didn't take you for a man who followed anyone's rules, let alone the ones governing the image of a Hanul executive," Tammy replied, her eyes meeting his. She felt a strange pull, a recognition of the rebellious heart, that mirrored her own current state of scorched earth defiance. "Rules are for those who lack the power to rewrite them," he said, stepping closer. The scent of sandalwood and cold rain was even more intoxicating here, stripped of the office's ozone. "That tattoo is a reminder of a time before I was the glacier. It's a reminder that beneath the balance sheets and the mergers, there is a cost to everything. Including this marriage." He reached out, his long fingers stopping just short of her chin. For a heartbeat, the contract felt like it might actually catch fire between them. "Do not mistake my cooperation for kindness, Tammy. I am giving you the keys to the kingdom because you are the only one with a sharp enough blade to cut out the rot. But if you blink, if you let your sentiment for what Brad used to be cloud your judgment, I will liquidate you along with him." "I stopped blinking the moment I saw that photo," Tammy said, her voice a steady, velvet-wrapped steel. Jae-min nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "Good. The tablet is on the desk. Sleep if you can. The war starts at dawn." He walked away, leaving her standing in the doorway of her new life. Inside the room, the scent of expensive lilies, the same scent from the boutique, filled the air, but here it felt like an irony. She walked to the desk where the sleek, silver tablet glowed with an invitation to destruction. She picked it up, the screen flickering to life as it recognized her face. The first file on the desktop was labeled Whitaker, B, disciplinary/personnel. Tammy sat down in the plush velvet chair, the dragon's lair silent around her. She didn't feel like a victim anymore. She felt like a hunter. As she opened the first file, the reflection in the glass windows showed a woman who no longer looked like royalty, but like a revolutionary preparing to burn down the palace. The morning of the wedding did not arrive with the soft, romantic glow Tammy had once envisioned. Instead, it broke with a sharp, clinical brightness that illuminated the Bukhansan foothills like a stage light. There were no bridesmaids fluttering through the hallways of the Kong estate, no champagne toasts, and no nervous laughter. There was only the low hum of a world-class security detail and the rhythmic, steady heartbeat of a woman who was no longer a bride, but a strategist. Tammy stood before the mirror in her quarters, the same space where she had spent the last 2 nights dissecting Brad Whitaker's professional life. On the bed lay the gown Kang Jae-min's personal stylists had delivered, a structural masterpiece of heavy, architectural silk. It lacked the delicate lace and sentimental beading of her original dress at Maison de Lanque. This gown was stark, ivory, and floor-length, with a high collar and clean lines that felt less like a garment and more like a suit of armor. As she stepped into it, the cool weight of the silk settled over her shoulders, grounding her. She fastened a single, teardrop-shaped emerald pendant around her neck, a piece from the Kong family vault that symbolized her new, high-stakes station. The ceremony took place in the estate's private glass pavilion, a structure that seemed to float over a precipice. The guest list was lethal, 12 people, representing the most powerful banking and political interests in South Korea. They were not here to celebrate a union, they were here to audit a narrative. Among them sat Elizabeth Park's father, his eyes narrowed as he looked for any sign of the American placeholder Brad had described. Tammy took her place at the end of the aisle. For the first time since the night in the office, she saw Jae-min waiting for her. He wore a tailored black suit that emphasized his athletic, refined build. The collar was closed today, hiding the dragon tattoo, but the intensity in his dark eyes was more focused than ever. He stood with a calm, unreadable dominance, his posture radiating the protective yet controlled energy of a man who had just secured his empire. As Tammy walked toward him, her gaze didn't waver. She saw Brad standing near the back, his face a mask of panicked disbelief, his athletic frame tense as he watched the woman he thought he had liquidated walk toward the most powerful man in the country. Beside him, Elizabeth looked on with concerned uncertainty, the consequences of their betrayal finally manifesting as a wall of power they could never hope to scale. When Tammy reached the altar, Jae-min reached out and took her hand. His touch was firm, a silent anchor in the sea of scrutiny. As they spoke the vows mandated by the contract, something shifted in the atmosphere. The glacier didn't melt, but for the first time, his gaze softened into something that wasn't purely clinical. He looked at the way Tammy held herself, the high cheekbones, the expressive almond eyes filled with controlled anger and strength, and for a fleeting moment, he wasn't looking at a business asset. He was looking at a woman who had turned humiliation into a lethal opportunity. To the future, Jae-min murmured, his voice a low vibration that only she could hear. It wasn't a romantic sentiment, it was a battle cry. He leaned in, and as he placed a hand subtly around her waist in a protective stance, the flash of a single, high-society photographer's camera captured the moment that would rebrand a scandal as a dynasty. Tammy didn't look at Brad as she turned to exit the pavilion as Mrs. Kang Jae-min. She looked forward, her eyes directed away from her past, symbolizing an emotional and strategic separation that was now permanent. The revenge had begun, and the silk armor she wore was unyielding. The victory of the wedding pavilion had been a masterstroke of theater, but the real blood was drawn in the quiet, carpeted corners of the corporate world. 2 days after the ceremony, the air in the private dining room of the Gilded Orchid was thick with the scent of seared wagyu and the unsaid. Brad Whitaker sat across from Tammy, his physical presence, usually so commanding and athletic, now seeming frantic, a stark contrast to the predatory stillness he once possessed. He had requested this private dinner under the guise of settling lingering logistics, but the way he gripped his wine glass told a different story. Tammy, look, I know you're hurt. I know the Kong thing is a brilliant move for protection, Brad began, leaning in, his voice dropping into that familiar, persuasive register he used for closing marketing deals. But let's be realistic. You're an American in a culture that values deep-rooted lineage. Jae-min is using you to shield a merger. Once that ink is dry, he'll discard you. Come back to the penthouse. We can fix this. Elizabeth, it was a mistake, a biological complication. I can handle her father if you just stop this charade. Tammy didn't touch her drink. She sat in her structural silk, her almond eyes reflecting the candlelight with a cold, observant clarity. She felt the weight of the decrypted tablet in her bag, containing the evidence of Brad's misappropriated expense accounts and the forged signatures he'd used to cover Elizabeth's medical appointments. You still think I'm a problem to be handled, Brad, she said, her voice like a calm sea before a storm. You think I'm a variable you can talk back into a box. I'm trying to save your life. Brad snapped, his frustration finally breaching the surface. You don't belong on the 70th floor. You don't know how this company breathes. You're a placeholder, Tammy. Just wait until Monday morning when you realize you have no standing here. The heavy oak doors of the dining room opened with a silent, heavy grace. Kang Jae-min stepped in, his presence immediately shifting the room's atmospheric pressure. He didn't look at Brad. He walked directly to Tammy, placing a steady, possessive hand on her shoulder. The gesture was a silent anchor, but his eyes were fixed on the man across the table. Monday morning has arrived early, Director Whitaker, Jae-min said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that made the silver on the table vibrate. He didn't sit, he simply loomed, the shadow of his authority stretching over Brad's panicked expression. I believe you were under the impression that Mrs. Kang would be retreating into domestic silence. You are mistaken. Jae-min reached into his jacket and placed a formal Hanol Corporation appointment letter on the table. As of 3 hours ago, the board of directors has ratified a new executive structure. Tammy Brooks Kang is not just my wife, she has been appointed as the senior international strategy consultant for Hanol. She is now the primary auditor for the marketing division. Brad's face went a sickly shade of gray. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The woman he had cheated on, the woman he thought he could manage back into submission, was now his direct superior. Which means, Tammy added, finally picking up her glass and taking a slow, deliberate sip, that when you submit your quarterly audits tomorrow morning, you will be submitting them to me. I've already spent the weekend looking at your consultancy fees in Singapore, Brad. The ones that didn't have a corresponding client meeting. Your world isn't crumbling because of a marriage. It's crumbling because you forgot that I'm the one who taught you how to hide the tracks you're now tripping over. Jae-min looked down at Tammy, and for a fleeting second, that rebellious heart flashed in his eyes, a shared, dark satisfaction in the hunt. He leaned in toward Brad, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of an execution. I suggest you go home and start packing your desk, Whitaker. My wife is a very thorough auditor. As Jae-min led Tammy out of the room, Brad was left in the silence of his own making, his stable future dissolving into a pile of shredded documents and a legacy that had just been liquidated by the woman he underestimated. The hunt was no longer in the shadows, it was in the ledger. The air in the boardroom on the 68th floor was thick with the scent of high-grade espresso and the ozone of a failing negotiation. Across the massive conference table, the representatives of the Arnault Group, a European conglomerate whose luxury brand portfolio was essential to Hanol's global expansion, sat with their arms folded. Their lead negotiator, a man whose reputation for uncompromising standards preceded him, was already tucking his fountain pen back into his breast pocket. The merger that Jae-min had built his entire quarterly strategy around was seconds away from a quiet, devastating collapse. Jae-min stood at the head of the table, his posture a study in controlled tension. He was a man used to breaking the will of his opponents through sheer economic weight, but these were Europeans who valued cultural prestige as much as profit. They didn't care about Hanol's sheer size, they cared that Hanol seemed to lack the soul required to represent their heritage brands in the East. Jae-min's logic was flawless, but it was cold. It lacked the human variable. I believe we have reached an impasse, the Frenchman stated, his voice a dry rasp. Hanul is a formidable machine, Mr. Kong. But our brands are not cogs. They are stories. And we do not see ourselves in your story. Tammy, who had been sitting quietly at the periphery of the meeting, leaned forward. She had spent the last 72 hours not just auditing Brad's failures, but rebuilding the entire narrative of the Arnault partnership. She didn't look at the Frenchman. She looked at the portfolio of images spread out before him, ads that Brad had approved, which were generic, flashy, and utterly devoid of the brand's history. You don't see yourselves in the story because you're looking at the wrong author, Tammy said, her voice cutting through the tension like a silk ribbon. Every head in the room turned. Jae-min's gaze shifted to her, his dark eyes narrowing in a mix of warning and curiosity. The marketing files you were presented with by Director Whitaker were based on a manageability model, Tammy continued, rising from her seat with a structural grace that commanded the room. She walked to the digital display and swiped away the generic ads. In their place, she projected the research she had unearthed from the Arnault archives, sketches from the 1920s, references to the specific artisans who had built the brand's foundation. Hanul doesn't want to buy your heritage. We want to be the gallery that houses it. My strategy isn't about market penetration, it's about cultural preservation. She spoke for the next 20 minutes, outlining a strategy that combined Hanul's logistics with a deeply nuanced understanding of the Arnault legacy. She didn't use corporate jargon, she used the language of the brands themselves. She turned the Hanul machine into a protective fortress for European artistry. The change in the room was palpable. The Frenchman's arms unfolded. He began to lean in, his eyes tracking the connections Tammy was making between their history and Seoul's future. By the time she finished, the silence in the room was no longer cold, it was electrified. This, the Frenchman whispered, gesturing toward Tammy's projected deck. This is the Seoul we were looking for. Mr. Kong, your senior consultant has a rare gift for seeing the variables we ourselves had forgotten. After the papers were signed and the room cleared, only Jae-min and Tammy remained. The glacier didn't speak for a long time. He walked over to where Tammy was packing her notes, his shadow falling over her. When she looked up, she didn't see the CEO evaluating an asset. She saw a man who had finally met his match. I thought I hired a shield, Jae-min said, his voice a low, resonant rumble. He reached out, his fingers grazing the edge of her tablet. I didn't realize I had invited a general into my ranks. A shield only works if someone is holding it, Tammy replied, her almond eyes meeting his with a shared, lethal intelligence. A general wins the war before it starts. Jae-min didn't pull away. For the first time, the distance between them wasn't dictated by a contract, but by a burgeoning, dangerous respect. He realized then that Tammy wasn't just a part of the narrative he was building, she was the one writing it. She was the Hanul variable he had never expected, a strategic genius who didn't just rival him, but challenged the very foundation of his cold, calculated world. The partnership was no longer a facade, it was becoming a formidable, dual-headed empire. The morning following the Arnault breakthrough, the air in the Hanul executive suite felt different, less like a corporate office and more like a command center. Tammy sat behind her new desk on the 68th floor, the decrypted tablet glowing with the final pieces of Brad Whitaker's professional coffin. But as she scrolled through his private communications, a recurring theme emerged that the data hadn't fully captured. Brad hadn't just stolen from the company, he had weaponized the truth to isolate Elizabeth Park. Tammy arranged a meeting at a quiet, glass-walled tea house overlooking the Han River, a place far removed from the predatory eyes of the Kong estate or the Hanul boardroom. When Elizabeth arrived, she looked nothing like the confident heiress Tammy had seen at the wedding. She was pale, her pregnancy beginning to show beneath a loose silk blouse, and her eyes were clouded with the same frantic uncertainty that had once plagued Tammy. I didn't think you'd ever want to see me again, Elizabeth said, her voice barely a whisper as she sat down. She looked at Tammy, now a senior consultant and the wife of the most powerful man in the industry, with a mixture of fear and reluctant admiration. I'm not here to talk about the wedding, Elizabeth, Tammy began, her voice calm and lacking the sharp edge she reserved for Brad. I'm here because I've been looking at the timeline of your relationship with Brad. He told you I was a temporary American contract worker who refused to leave, didn't he? He told you that I was blackmailing him for a visa. Elizabeth's breath hitched. He said you were unstable. That you were obsessed with his position and that he was only with you out of pity until he met me. Tammy slid a physical folder across the table. Inside were printed logs of Brad's messages to Tammy from only a month ago. Vows of eternal love, plans for their future home, and confirmation of their wedding deposits. He played us both, Elizabeth. He used my loyalty to build his career and your father's influence to secure his future. You weren't his fated love any more than I was his pity project. You were his next acquisition. As Elizabeth looked through the documents, the color drained from her face. The reality of Brad's manipulation began to settle in. The lies he had told her father, the forged documents he had used to explain his late nights. She wasn't just a partner in a scandal, she was a victim of a strategic narcissist. He told my father that if I didn't marry him soon, the scandal would ruin our family's reputation before the merger, Elizabeth confessed, her hands trembling. I felt like I had no choice. Tammy reached across the table, her touch steady. You do have a choice. Brad's world is already liquidating. My husband and I have the evidence to end his career tomorrow, but your reputation doesn't have to be collateral damage. I'm offering you a golden parachute. Elizabeth looked up, her expressive eyes clearing. What do you mean? Help me destroy the one thing he still thinks he has, his reputation for integrity with your father, Tammy said, her tone shifting to that of a seasoned strategist. Provide me with the logs of his private conversations regarding the merger bribes he discussed with your father's aides. In return, Hanul will issue a formal statement framing your separation as a mutual decision based on irreconcilable professional differences. You walk away with your dignity and a generous trust for your child. Brad walks away with nothing. For the first time, a spark of defiance lit up Elizabeth's features. She looked at the woman who had been her rival and saw instead an architect of justice. He told me you were nothing without him. He was so wrong. He usually is, Tammy replied, a cold, satisfied smile touching her lips. By tonight, I want those logs. Let's make sure Brad Whitaker realizes that the women he tried to silence are the ones who will finally write his ending. As Elizabeth left, Tammy remained at the table, watching the sun set over the river. The Hanul variable was growing. She had turned an enemy into an ally, and the final wall Brad had built around himself, the Park family influence, was about to be demolished from the inside. The downfall of Brad Whitaker did not end with a bang, but with the cold, rhythmic hum of a high-capacity industrial shredder. By Monday afternoon, the 68th floor was a graveyard of ambition. Tammy stood in the center of the executive suite, her ivory silk armor replaced by a sharp, tailored charcoal suit that matched the steel of her resolve. Across the glass foyer, she watched as security personnel, acting on direct orders from the CEO, oversaw the final liquidation of Brad's professional life. Brad stood by his desk, stripped of the tailored jacket that had given him his false sense of armor. His once athletic frame seemed to have collapsed in on itself as he shoveled a life's worth of marketing certificates and forged expense reports into a cardboard box. Every few seconds, he glanced up, his eyes searching for an ally, but he found none. The Park family had officially retracted their support at dawn, and Elizabeth's provided logs had acted as the final nail in his coffin. He was not just fired, he was being erased from the industry. It's over, Brad, Tammy said, her voice carrying across the quiet office with a terrifying, level clarity. The blacklist is active. Every recruiter in the Asia-Pacific region has received the audit. There is no version of the story where you remain a director. Brad looked at her, and for the first time, the manipulation was gone. There was only raw, trembling fear. You think you've won? You're just another project for Jaemin. You're the Hanol variable until he finds a more efficient equation. That's where you're wrong, a deep, resonant voice interrupted. Kang Jaemin stepped from his inner sanctum, his hand finding the small of Tammy's back in a gesture that was no longer purely for the cameras. He held a silver Hano credit card, the company's highest tier of executive access, and placed it on the desk between them. My wife is not an equation. She is the solution. And you are merely a rounding error that has been corrected. Jaemin nodded to the guards, and within seconds, the man who had tried to silence Tammy Brooks was escorted out of the building. Brad's world had been systematically dismantled, his career liquidated, and his pride shredded. The villain had been removed from the board. But as the heavy glass doors hissed shut behind the security detail, Tammy found that the rush of revenge was strangely absent. She didn't feel the need to gloat or to watch the elevator numbers descend. Instead, she found herself intensely aware of the man standing beside her. She could feel the steady warmth of his hand through the fabric of her suit, and the scent of sandalwood and cold rain, the scent she had once associated only with a cold contract, now felt like a sanctuary. She turned to look at him, her almond eyes searching his face. Jaemin wasn't looking at the door where Brad had disappeared. He was looking at her, his expression stripped of its glacier mask. The dragon tattoo peeked out from his collar, a reminder of the rebellion that lay beneath his CEO exterior. In that moment, the power dynamic shifted again. The war against Brad was won, but a new, more complex negotiation was beginning, one that didn't involve auditors or boardrooms. You performed brilliantly, Jaemin murmured, his thumb grazing her waist. The Arno Group is already asking for the next phase of your cultural strategy. I'm not thinking about Arno right now, Tammy admitted, her voice dropping into a register of honest vulnerability. The silence between them stretched, thick and charged with a new kind of tension. For weeks, she had focused every ounce of her strategic genius on the man who had betrayed her. Now, standing in the wreckage of Brad's legacy, she realized she was far more focused on the man who had helped her burn it down. The contract had brought them together, and logic had kept them aligned, but as Jaemin's gaze held hers, she realized they were no longer just business assets. They were two rebels who had finally found a cause worth fighting for, each other. The 6-month mark arrived not with a celebration, but with the quiet, methodical precision that had come to define Tammy's life within the Kang estate. In her private study, the silver tablet lay dark. The files on Brad Whitaker were no longer active, they were historical records of a successful liquidation. Brad had vanished from the Seoul skyline, relegated to a cautionary tale in regional marketing textbooks, and Elizabeth Park had quietly relocated to a private villa in Jeju, her golden parachute, ensuring a life of peace and distance. The revenge was complete. The audit was closed. Tammy stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the first blossoms of a new spring struggle against the lingering mountain chill. She was dressed in a simple, elegant traveling suit, her bags already staged near the foyer. According to the original 15-page document she had signed in a state of scorched earth defiance, her role as the fated love of Hanol's CEO was officially terminated at midnight. She had delivered the merger, saved the Arno partnership, and purged the rot from the 68th floor. She had fulfilled every clause. A soft click of the door signaled Jaemin's arrival. He didn't speak immediately. He walked to the desk and looked at the space where the original contract had once lived. The glacier was gone, replaced by a man whose intensity was no longer a weapon of intimidation, but a bridge of connection. The dragon tattoo was visible above his open collar, a silent testament to the rebel she had grown to understand. The car is waiting to take you to the airport, Jaemin said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate in the small of her back. Your severance package has been processed. The senior consultant title is yours to keep, regardless of where you choose to go. Tammy turned to face him, her almond eyes searching his for a trace of the clinical logic that had started this journey. I did what I came to do, Jaemin. The variables are all balanced. There's no reason for me to stay in the lair. Jae-min reached into his inner pocket, but he didn't pull out a check or a formal resignation acceptance. Instead, he laid a single, heavy sheet of vellum on the desk. It wasn't 15 pages of legalistic prose. It was a single paragraph, written in his own bold, decisive hand. I ran a final audit this morning, he murmured, stepping into her personal space, the scent of sandalwood and cold rain enveloping her like a familiar silk armor. I realized that there is one recurring cost I didn't account for in the original merger. The cost of your absence. The Arnaud Group doesn't want Hanul's logistics, they want your soul. And I find that I no longer have the capacity to manage this empire without the woman who taught me how to see the heart behind the strategy. Tammy looked down at the vellum. It wasn't a business agreement. There were no clauses of power or liquidated damages. It was a new contract. One with no end date, no clinical boundaries, and no strategic exits. It was a commitment to a life that wasn't built on the ruins of her past, but on the foundation of their shared future. This isn't a strategic move, Jae-min, Tammy whispered, her voice trembling slightly for the first time in months. There's no revenge left to fuel this. The revenge is over, Jae-min agreed, his hand finding the side of her face, his thumb grazing her jawline with a tenderness that no camera would ever capture. The life begins. I don't want a faded love for the cameras, Tammy. I want the variable I can't calculate. I want you. Tammy looked from the paper to the man who had become her anchor in the storm. She realized then that the ivory gown and the senior consultant title were just the beginning. The real victory wasn't seeing Brad crumble, it was standing here, in the heart of the dragon's lair, and feeling completely at home. She picked up the silver pen, the same one she had used to sign her life away 6 months ago, and signed the vellum. She wasn't signing for protection or power this time. She was signing for herself. As Jae-min drew her in, the cold mountain air outside felt irrelevant. The audit was finally over, and for the first time in her life, the future wasn't a strategy. It was a reality they would write together. Thank you for listening and kindly subscribe to my channel.